Ethan Walker believed in a simple philosophy: mind your own business and let others do the same. His farm, Greywood Acres, wasn't just land, it was his legacy, passed down through generations of Walkers who had survived droughts, storms, and every hardship life could throw at them. The sun rose early over the rolling green fields, casting golden light across the weathered red barn that had stood strong for nearly 70 years. The scent of fresh earth and hay mixed with the crisp morning air as his rooster crowed from its perch, signaling the start of another day. To Ethan, this was peace. Hard-earned, honest, and undisturbed. But that peace was about to be shattered by something far more relentless than a summer drought or a winter freeze: Victoria Langley. The self-appointed queen of the Greywood Gardens Homeowners Association had built her reputation on strict rules and ruthless enforcement. Her perfectly manicured neighborhood, filled with identical houses and pristine white fences, stood in sharp contrast to Ethan's untamed land. She saw herself as the guardian of order, and Ethan's farm, his proud, hard-working way of life, was an eyesore in her carefully curated world. It started with an unexpected visit. Ethan was sitting on his porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, watching the morning unfold when he spotted her approaching. She moved with the stiff determination of a general inspecting enemy territory, her beige slacks perfectly pressed, her white blouse spotless despite the dust that clung to the air. A clipboard was clutched in one hand, her expression a tight mask of forced politeness. "Good morning," she said, her voice clipped and businesslike. "You must be Mr. Walker." Ethan took a slow sip of his coffee, his sharp blue eyes studying her before he answered. "That's me. Can I help you?" She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes. "I'm Victoria Langley, president of the Greywood Gardens Homeowners Association. I'm here to discuss a matter of great importance regarding your property." Ethan raised an eyebrow, already sensing where this was going. "Didn't know my farm had anything to do with your HOA. "Well," she began, her tone laced with condescension, "technically, it doesn't. However, as I'm sure you're aware, Greywood Gardens borders your property, and we've received multiple complaints from residents. Property values are a delicate thing, Mr. Walker. A well-kept community thrives when all elements are in harmony." Ethan set his mug down, leaning back in his chair. "Complaints, huh? About what?" Victoria checked her clipboard, as if she needed to remind herself of the long list she had undoubtedly prepared. "For starters, the color of your barn. That bright red is a bit jarring. It clashes with the neutral aesthetic of our community. We believe it would be in everyone's best interest if you repainted it to something more subdued, perhaps a soft beige or light gray." Ethan stared at her for a moment, trying to decide if she was serious. That barn had been red for as long as it had stood, its color a signature of tradition and pride. "Repaint it," he said, a slow grin forming. "Not a chance." Victoria's smile tightened. "And then there's the matter of your rooster. Several residents have mentioned being woken up before sunrise. It's quite disruptive." Ethan chuckled, folding his arms across his chest. "So, let me get this straight. You want me to repaint my barn and somehow convince a rooster to hit the snooze button because your residents don't like the sound of the countryside?" Victoria's eyes flashed with impatience, though she kept her voice measured. "Mr. Walker, I understand change can be difficult, but this is really in everyone's best interest. I'd hate for this to become a more complicated issue." Ethan stood up, stretching lazily, letting the moment hang between them. "Well, Miss Langley, I appreciate you stopping by, but my farm isn't part of your HOA. I don't answer to your rules, and as far as I can tell, my barn, my rooster, and my land aren't hurting anyone." Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll see about that," she said sharply before turning on her heel and marching back to her car. Ethan watched her go, shaking his head. He had dealt with plenty of stubborn animals in his time, but something told him Victoria Langley was going to be an entirely different breed of problem. The trouble started just days after Victoria Langley's visit, though Ethan Walker had expected as much. He had seen the tight set of her jaw, the sharp glint in her eyes when he refused to bow to her demands. Women like her didn't take no for an answer, not when they were used to controlling everything in their path. Sure enough, the first letter arrived in his mailbox by the end of the week, stamped with the official Greywood Gardens Homeowners Association seal. It was laughable, really. A formal notice citing a list of supposed infractions, his barn color, the noise from his rooster, and even the presence of livestock, all of which, the letter claimed, were in violation of neighborhood standards. The irony nearly made him choke on his coffee. Ethan's farm had been there for over 100 years. Greywood Gardens had popped up less than a decade ago, and now they thought they could dictate how he ran his land? He crumpled the notice and tossed it in the trash, thinking that was the end of it. It wasn't. A week later, the county inspectors started showing up, one after another, as if someone had flipped a switch and set every bureaucratic agency in motion against him. First came a visit from the health department, a man in a neatly pressed uniform poking around his farm stand, checking produce, testing soil, and asking endless questions about sanitation procedures. The next day, it was zoning enforcement, demanding records of his land use and property lines, making vague comments about possible compliance issues. By the end of the week, animal control showed up, responding to an anonymous complaint about the inhumane conditions of his livestock. The officer took one look at his well-fed, free-roaming animals and shook his head. "Son, I don't know who you pissed off, but someone's got the county running in circles," the man muttered, tipping his hat as he left. Ethan already knew exactly who it was. He caught his first solid piece of proof when a county zoning officer let Victoria's name slip during an inspection. "Your farm's been flagged for review," the man had said, flipping through a folder of documents. "There's been community concern about whether livestock is even permitted in this area." Ethan frowned, arms crossed over his chest. Community concern? "Well, HOA representatives have raised the issue, and," the officer hesitated, but the damage was done. Victoria Langley had her fingerprints all over this. Still, the worst was yet to come. The real bombshell dropped when Ethan received an official cease and desist order, citing an obscure zoning technicality that claimed his land was not legally designated for agricultural use. If enforced, it could force him to sell off his livestock, his cattle, his chickens, everything. His entire livelihood. Ethan wasted no time. He drove straight to the county offices, demanding answers, but all he got were vague explanations about pending reviews and proper procedures. But then he heard something that made his blood run cold. There was talk that his land could be repurposed if he were forced to downsize. A developer had already approached the county about expanding Greywood Gardens into a new gated community. Ethan could barely contain his rage. That night, he sat at his kitchen table, reading the cease and desist order over and over, trying to piece together the game Victoria was playing. And then it clicked. She wasn't just trying to make his life miserable. She was trying to push him off his land. This wasn't about noise complaints or property values. It was about real estate. She wanted his farm gone. It was time to fight back. The next morning, he took a drive into town, stopping by the office of a friend, Jake Mitchell, who ran the local farmers market and had connections in all the right places. "I need a favor," Ethan said as he dropped the cease and desist letter on Jake's desk. "I need to find out exactly what Victoria Langley's been up to." Jake scanned the document, let out a low whistle, then leaned back in his chair. "She's playing dirty, that's for damn sure. Let me make some calls." Within a day, Ethan had confirmation of what he already suspected. Victoria had been hosting private meetings with county officials, lobbying them to tighten zoning laws, and pressuring inspectors to find violations on his land. She was building a legal case against him from the ground up, piece by piece. The next time she tried to sink her claws into his farm, he would be ready. Ethan Walker wasn't the kind of man to back down from a fight, but Victoria Langley had spent years perfecting her craft. She knew how to use rules, red tape, and bureaucracy as weapons, and she was far from done. The cease and desist order was just the beginning. If she couldn't push him off his land outright, she would make his life so miserable that he would have no choice but to leave. Ethan had been expecting more dirty tricks, but even he wasn't prepared for what came next. It started when he noticed a man lingering near the edge of his property. At first, he figured it was just another nosy HOA member, maybe even one of Victoria's lackeys checking to see if he had caved to their demands. But when the man returned the next day, this time with a drone, Ethan's patience wore thin. He watched from the porch, arms crossed, as the drone hovered over his barn, its small camera lens reflecting the morning sun. That was enough. He grabbed his hat, strode down toward the fence, and called out. "Hey! You lost?" The man barely looked at him. "Just conducting a routine survey." His voice was smooth, rehearsed. Ethan wasn't buying it. "On my land?" The man shrugged. "Just getting footage for a community report." Ethan stepped closer. "You work for the HOA?" No answer. The man adjusted the drone's controls. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Turn that thing around and get off my property." The man ignored him. Ethan had dealt with enough stubborn animals to know how this would play out. He reached for the drone, knocking it off course. It wobbled in the air before steadying, and that was when the man finally reacted. "Hey! You can't touch that. You can't trespass." Before Ethan could say another word, the man shoved him. It wasn't much, a light push, but enough to piss him off. He shoved back, harder. The man stumbled, catching himself before he fell. A moment later, Ethan heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel. Two sheriff's deputies pulled up, stepping out of their cruiser. Ethan sighed. Perfect timing. The so-called surveyor straightened his shirt, rubbing his arm. "Officers," he said, voice dripping with fake outrage. "This man just assaulted me." Ethan clenched his fists, realizing too late what had happened. He'd been set up. The deputies glanced between the two men. One of them, Deputy Harris, looked like he wasn't buying the act. The other, though, seemed less certain. "Sir, we're gonna need you to come with us." Ethan laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're arresting me?" The so-called victim nodded, his smug grin making Ethan's blood boil. "I'll be pressing charges." Ethan could do nothing as they cuffed him and led him to the cruiser. He didn't resist, no point in making things worse. As they drove away, he caught a glimpse of Victoria Langley standing on the sidewalk, arms folded across her chest. She wasn't even trying to hide her satisfaction. By the time Ethan posted bail the next morning, the damage was already done. Rumors had spread like wildfire. The local news ran a sensationalized segment about a local farmer arrested for assault, and by the time he got back to town, whispers followed him everywhere. It was exactly what Victoria wanted. She wasn't just attacking his land anymore. Now, she was coming for his reputation. Ethan had barely gotten back to work when the next blow landed. Someone had poisoned his livestock feed. He found his chickens sluggish, a few already dead, and his cattle refusing to eat. His gut twisted in anger. This wasn't nature. This was sabotage. His suspicions were confirmed when he checked the security footage. In the dead of night, a shadowy figure crept along the fence line and dumped something into the feed barrels. The image wasn't crystal clear, but the posture, the shape, he knew who it was. Victoria might not have done it herself, but she had sent someone. The next day, another county inspector showed up, this time from the health department. A new anonymous complaint had been filed, this time alleging that Ethan was selling contaminated food at the farmer's market. That was the final straw. The inspector, Tom Wilkins, was already familiar with Victoria's antics. "Look, Ethan, between you and me, this is a load of crap," he said, shaking his head. "But my hands are tied. With this complaint, I have to shut you down until we complete a full review." Ethan could barely process the words. Shut down? That meant no sales. No farmers market. No income. And right before Farmers' Fun Day, the biggest event of the season. Victoria Langley had finally done it. She had gone beyond harassment and crossed into deliberate sabotage. Ethan wasn't going to let her win. Not now. Not ever. It was time to go on the offensive. Ethan Walker had spent his life fighting off droughts, storms, and the occasional predator, but Victoria Langley was a different kind of threat, one that hid behind bureaucracy, wielding rules like weapons. She thought she had him cornered, that she had taken away his ability to fight back. But what she didn't know was that Ethan had spent the last week doing what he did best, working. Not on his farm, but on gathering evidence. He wasn't alone in this fight. People in town had started whispering, and not everyone in Greywood Gardens agreed with Victoria's crusade. Carol Parker, an HOA board member who had kept quiet until now, had finally had enough. She met Ethan at the back of the general store, handing him a manila folder thick with documents. "You didn't get this from me," she muttered. "But if you're looking for proof that Victoria's been using HOA money for personal expenses, here it is." Ethan opened the folder, his pulse quickening. There it was in black and white, financial records showing that Victoria had been diverting HOA funds to pay for her personal legal expenses, her fancy catered board meetings, even a landscaper who had exclusively maintained her own yard. It wasn't just unethical, it was fraud. And that wasn't all. Jake Mitchell, his friend from the farmer's market, had done some digging of his own. He handed Ethan a printed email chain between Victoria and a real estate developer. "She's been talking to these guys for months," Jake said. "She's trying to get your farm declared non-agricultural so they can rezone it for expansion. The second they push you off this land, they're gonna turn it into luxury townhomes." Ethan felt his grip tighten on the papers. This wasn't just about property values or neighborhood aesthetics. Victoria wanted his farm gone, not because of some HOA nonsense, but because she was setting herself up for a real estate deal that would make her rich. That was the last straw. The next HOA board meeting was packed. Word had gotten out that Ethan was coming, and people filled the seats, some homeowners furious, some curious, all eager to hear what was about to go down. Victoria sat at the front of the room, her ever-present clipboard resting in her lap, her smug confidence unwavering. She had no idea what was coming. Ethan didn't waste time. He walked to the front, dropped a thick stack of documents onto the table, and looked Victoria dead in the eye. "You've been harassing me for months. Filing false complaints. Sending people to spy on me. But this?" He tapped the folder. "This is real corruption. Misuse of HOA funds. Coercing county officials. Lying to your own community." Victoria let out a sharp laugh, waving a hand dismissively. "Mr. Walker, I have no idea what you're talking about. If you're upset about your violations, perhaps you should." "Save it," Ethan cut in. "I've got emails. Financial records. And security footage of the investigator you hired trespassing on my land." The room went silent. The color drained from Victoria's face. Then Ethan went for the kill. "You've been working with a developer. The second you get me off my farm, they're moving in. You're not protecting Greywood Gardens, you're selling it out." A murmur ran through the crowd. Homeowners turned to each other, eyes wide. The HOA had always been strict, but this? This was something else. Howard Sterling, the HOA president, cleared his throat. "Is this true, Victoria?" She hesitated for half a second too long. That was all it took. Carol stood up, shaking her head. She's been using our money for personal expenses. I saw the reports myself. She's been lying to us. Another board member, Frank Dawson, spoke next. And all these fake complaints against Walker? I've had enough of this. We've been wasting time and resources chasing a man who isn't even under our jurisdiction. Victoria's mask of composure cracked. This is ridiculous, she snapped. He's just trying to get back at me because I called him out for breaking the rules. No, Victoria, Ethan said calmly. You broke the rules. Howard sighed, rubbing his temples. I think we all know where this is going. He glanced around at the other board members, who were already nodding. I'm calling for a vote. Effective immediately, we will decide whether to remove Victoria Langley from her position as HOA president. The vote was unanimous. Victoria sat frozen, her hands trembling with fury as the reality set in. She had spent years ruling this neighborhood with an iron grip. And now, in a single night, it was gone. Ethan watched as she opened her mouth, then closed it again. She had no allies left. No power. No way to fight back. And he wasn't done yet. Victoria Langley was gone. Stripped of her title, humiliated in front of the very people she had ruled over, and left with nothing but the weight of her own arrogance, she did what most people like her would do, she ran. Within a week, her house was up for sale, the "for sale" sign standing like a surrender flag in the pristine lawn she had once obsessed over. Word spread quickly that she wasn't just leaving Graywood Gardens. She was leaving town altogether. No one would miss her. Ethan Walker didn't bother attending her final HOA meeting, the one where the board officially disavowed her actions and promised the community that steps would be taken to prevent abuses of power in the future. He didn't need to hear it. Victoria was just another failed tyrant, left to deal with the consequences of her own downfall. But he wasn't about to let her legacy live on in Graywood Acres. The morning after her moving trucks disappeared down the road, Ethan erected a new sign at the edge of his property, facing Graywood Gardens. Bold, black letters on a whitewashed wooden plank read: Welcome to Graywood Acres, no HOA, no nonsense, no Victorias. It didn't take long for the sign to become a local attraction. People drove out just to take pictures with it, the story of the Battle of Graywood spreading beyond their small town. What had started as a petty war against one man's way of life had ended with the entire community rallying behind him. And as for Victoria? Karma didn't waste time. A few months later, Ethan got wind that Victoria had moved into another HOA-run neighborhood in a nearby town. But this time, she wasn't the one making the rules, she was just another homeowner under the thumb of an even more ruthless HOA board. It wasn't long before she started receiving her own violations, her grass half an inch too tall, her trash cans left out 5 minutes too early, her holiday decorations deemed excessive. Poetic justice at its finest. Ethan never saw her again, but every morning, as he sipped his coffee on his porch, he'd glance at that sign at the property line and smirk. Graywood Acres was Victoria-free, and that was exactly how it was going to stay. But stories like his weren't rare. How many others had faced the wrath of an HOA gone too far? How many had fought back, and won? Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.